I have you all unmuted at the moment, so and there are too many of you for me to go around and let you introduce yourselves, but we know you're there, and thank you all for registering. I am going to ask my colleague Keisha, who's on the line with me, whom many of you hopefully have had conversations with or email conversations with, because Keisha is the CCAT queen. She is the one who keeps us all together, whatever kinds of information we need. She is the person who has been diligently providing the most exquisite customer service, hopefully, to all of you as you've needed it over the last year. So, Keisha, why don't we go ahead and mute everybody? And I am assuming that you will all be able to hear me. What I'd like to ask you all to do throughout today's webinar is to feel free to send any questions or comments that you have throughout the presentation to Keisha via the chat option, which is on the right of your WebEx screen. And if you see it says send to, and at the bottom, and then if you click the arrows, you will see Keisha's name. And if you could actually just send it to Keisha, if you have any questions or comments, then I'll be able to make sure that I know about that and that I address them as you go. All right? I will also ask Keisha to unmute you all later so that we can actually do a little bit of Q&A for particular things that, you know, the whole group would benefit from, and have a conversation if we have time left at the end, okay? So let's get going. I'm Julie Simpson. I direct the nonprofit strategy and capacity building practice at TCC Group. I have the pleasure of using the CCAT with many of our nonprofit clients, and I know that most of you on the phone have either, I think there's 2 of you that were certified before 2011, but then the rest of you have been sort of certified facilitators sometime over the last 5 years. And we have been talking about getting an actual community of CCAT facilitators and certified facilitators together over the last few years, and we're finally going to do it. It's really helpful. It's very valuable. We at TCC are continually thinking and talking about the ways that we use the CCAT with our clients. I'm going to get into that in a minute, but we also are continually adding ways in which we facilitate or interpret the CCAT to our bag of tricks, and we realized not long ago that we have not had a refresher course or any kind of mechanism to reach out to all of you who have been using the CCAT in quite a while, and it's really important that we keep you closer. And so we are looking at building a community of CCAT users, and we'll talk about some of the reasons that we're doing that as we go through today. I want to thank all of you, first of all, for registering, for taking time today to hang out with me and us on the phone, and also for filling out this survey that we sent you. We've constructed this time together with quite a bit of thought to the ways that you guys answered your questions and what you said you wanted to learn about, and we've tried to put each one of them in here in some way, shape, or form when you said that this is what you wanted to learn about. So if we get to the end and you still feel like there's aspects of the learning that haven't been addressed today, I will definitely welcome your thoughts on that, and we'll try and do these on a regular basis and provide continual opportunities for us to talk together about this stuff. Okay? So what are we going to do this afternoon? We are going to have a brief overview. You all know the CCAT. This was not publicized as a 101, so I'm assuming that everybody on the call has either been on the call or has been using the CCAT for a while or is just recently becoming certified, so you know the nuts and bolts of it, but you know, if there are any questions regarding those that you have, I'll certainly welcome those as we go today. We have 90 minutes booked for this. If you need to drop off before then, that's fine. You know, we're also recording this so that you will have access to it should you want it to share with others or to just review and, hear it again if you should so desire. We're going to talk about how you interpret the results, how you work with your clients in doing that, the different ways that we use the CCAT at TCC. We'll talk about, we're going to spend a lot of time in talking through what we call targeted capacity building. And this is something that relates to a briefing paper that my colleagues and I at TCC Group published a little over a year and a half ago, I think, maybe more, called Capacity Building 3.0 or CB 3.0. And we talk about the different ways that folks need to be thinking. We think we need to be thinking about capacity building differently, and we are using data and assessments like the CCAT slightly differently, and I'll get into talking about that. And we'll talk a little bit more about our ideas for future sessions and then invite you to share your ideas in that same vein with us. So the CCAT overview. You all know this, but these are the things that I really emphasize for anybody who's thinking about administering the CCAT to their grantees, if it's a foundation, to any individual nonprofit that we work with. And we use the CCAT for our strategic planning work, for our capacity building work. So sometimes it's just one organization that's taking it in relation to a project we're doing with them. If any of you do strategic planning, I'll talk about how we use it in strategic planning. It's incredibly helpful. And we emphasize, of course, as I'm sure you do, and you can't emphasize it enough, that it is not a report card. It is not a scorecard. We've done everything we can to try and avoid folks thinking about it that way. It is an organizational learning tool, and it is actually a leadership tool. It's meant to be a discussion starter. We talk about the CCAT as a comprehensive framework for facilitating discussion and talking about effectiveness, and often using the results of the CCAT to spark conversations between board and staff, or between staff members, or between funders and grantees. But it's really most effective to be thought about as a really comprehensive framework discussion starter. Looking at the organization as a whole. We really stress it's not the be-all and end-all, and all the information in it needs to be taken very seriously in relationship to other types of data that you're collecting. It's just one tool, and there's certain aspects of the CCAT that in few occasions don't actually apply to certain organizations. The most obvious is the volunteer strength and the volunteerism and the ability to organize and guide volunteers. There are some organizations that don't use volunteers at all, and so those scores I usually tell people to ignore. They don't really skew the overall scores that one is getting. And finally, as I said, it is a leadership tool, and in particular, we have been encouraging folks to use it to prioritize the capacities that really need to be focused on and need to be built. And the CCAT results and the ways that we've been interpreting it recently, when combined with a facilitation, active facilitation of a nonprofit or a group of nonprofits, is really powerful in helping groups dig in even deeper than they had previously by just using what is page 11 in the CCAT, where you have the prioritized recommendations. We go much further than that, and we'll talk about how we do that. So how do we use it? We access organizational effectiveness information. So we use it in our strategic planning efforts because we tend to balance the mission, vision, values of an organization with their internal capacities, with what we learn about the external environment when we're planning. And it gives us this fantastic base to be able to say, well, yeah, those are your strategic priorities, that's the way you want to go. This is how equipped you are right now to be able to do that. And just so you know, it's going to take longer to build up those capacities should you want to go in that direction. This is what we know. It really is helping us build capacity building plans. This is what I want to spend a lot of time talking about today. When working with funders in particular, and it's something that I'd love to encourage you all to talk to us about, and we can help share with you our ideas. We got some questions from some of you about marketing your role as a consultant to funders in relation to the CCAT, and I want to talk about how we are thinking about it in different ways with you, the funder, the nonprofit, you as the consultant or the MSO, the management support organization, and the funder, and the companies and corporations and foundations and the nonprofits all being part of a community together, a learning community around capacity building. So we're encouraging the use of the CCAT prior to building capacity building plans, both for nonprofits and for foundations. We use the CCAT pretty extensively in our evaluative efforts, where when you want to build your capacity, you can obviously, or when a funder wants to provide specific type of capacity building support, we use the CCAT as a pre and post, where let's just say that you as a consultant are working with a funder or with a nonprofit on, let's say, adaptive capacity building in particular, really developing the ways in which an organization takes in data, collects the right data, analyzes, reflects on that data, and then makes adjustments in what they do to be more impactful as a result of that data, all of which obviously you know constitutes adaptive capacity. In many cases, we'll use the CCAT as a pre and post. We use it before or at the beginning of the organization's capacity building efforts, and then we often, foundations like to use it as a marker to see how effective the work an organization's been doing or the capacity building they've been buying how it's worked, how it's been helping the progress. And I've said this to many of you before, but we know, because we've done this many years in using the CCAT in longitudinal studies, that it's very common for scores to go down, not up, after about a year's time. And so we recommend that if you're going to use it in a longitudinal manner, that you don't re-administer it before about 18 months to 2 years, usually about 18 months and then another 3 years. And that works in an interesting way. So we use it that way. We have collected CCAT results across cohorts, and we do this aggregate look, which is not simply an averaging, but it is taking all of the results that we have gotten from, say, a group of 40 grantees from a specific funder that might be regional in scope, geographic, regional, or it could be content connected. It could be a group of environmental policy organizations from around the country, for example, and we're building a cohort. So we look at those and then we further split them out and cluster the groups in helping a funder design capacity building initiatives, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and how we've been doing that. So what do we do? How do we work with the CCAT? It's in various degrees of intensity, usually, and it has to do, of course, with budget, with the appetite of a funder if it's being supported by a funder. And I know many of you have worked in conjunction with funders to work with, more than one organization or more than one grantee. So, the simplest form of sort of transaction that we have with the CCAT is actually not even on here anymore because I really discourage it, and that is for organizations to go to our website and to purchase it, or to call Keisha and say, I'd like to actually buy 5 CCATs. And I don't think many of you do that because I think your involvement with them is as an interpreter. But in the case that somebody can just come on our website and still purchase the CCAT alone for, $250 to $350, depending on how many they're buying, is something that people have been able to do for years, and they still do it. And we're really toying with the idea of making that impossible, only because I think it is so, it's so unlikely. And I say this as having been a nonprofit CEO for many decades and then running a foundation where I did a lot of capacity building work. Even the most enlightened nonprofit leader with the best of intentions, when administering the CCAT, will get the report and look at the report themselves, and then the ability for them to really have the time and be able to add the implementation or the real deep understanding of the CCAT and then take it into action and actually make change in their organizations, I think it's unlikely. I think people are too busy. I think nonprofits are too strapped. And so we're thinking very hard about how to encourage the real change to happen and not for people to waste their money, not saying that it's not valuable just to take the CCAT unto itself, but the interpretation and the real thorough understanding of the CCAT adds so much value that in the least, this first box that says introductory meeting and CCAT orientation, it's when the organization and the consultant meet to introduce the CCAT. The organizational lead and the survey takers participate in an introductory meeting and a CCAT orientation session. It's incredibly helpful. Most of you do these for your clients. It really does help the organizations appreciate a little bit better that this is not to be a report card, it's not a scorecard, that it's about authenticity and that they're not going to be judged or harshly, there's nothing punitive, and that, this is about their learning. That helps they understand what it's about and they can take it better. When we go to the next box, which is the interpretation, they have taken the CCAT, and there's, our favorite way to deal with it is at least to have an hour of a 1 to 2 hour session to discuss the main themes in the CCAT, to really go through the targeted capacity building 6 steps, which we'll talk about today, with the organization. And what this does is it really helps them begin to prioritize. A straight interpretation session usually doesn't include those 6 steps. It just really goes through, what does this mean? How do I see this? How can you actually take further actions to have conversations that are really beneficial? And we like that added value as well. We really encourage these days a series of conversations. It's usually at least 2, if not 3, for the CCAT results to be fully digested in an interpretation session, and then to go through what we're going to go through today, which are the full 6 steps of understanding what is it that you really need to be changing as an organization. What is your priority? There's usually a particular capacity that without attention and without change in the organization, no additional investment in capacity building whatsoever is actually going to stick, and we need to address and make the change happen in that identified capacity that we've brought out. Sometimes it's a bigger deal, sometimes it's a smaller deal, sometimes it's organizational in nature, sometimes it's vision and mission and articulation of direction related. But it is not that hard to figure it out. The added piece that we've been working with that relates to the CB 3.0 is this notion of determining what your prioritized capacity is as an organization through the lens of not just your own organization in a vacuum, but your organization in relation to the others that live in the ecosystem you work in. So it could be others that do the same work you do. It could be the others in your geographic community. It could be your funders. It could be, there's a lot of things that we want to consider when thinking about the specific capacity that you want to build. So these are the different ways that we use it, and as I said, we're going to get into these in much greater detail. So how do you prepare for your sessions? I'm assuming this is what you already do, but just as a sort of reminder, check off. I'm imagining that you are identifying the overall themes when you look at an organization's CCAT. This is an individual organization we're talking about right now, not a collection of organizations, because we do that too. And one of the first things that we look at, that I look at, is the life cycle chart and where an organization has actually placed themselves in the life cycle chart. And there's this I use that language when I'm talking to organizations intentionally, where you've placed yourself, where you've noted that you would like to see some kind of change. It's very common, and I think you all have probably found too, that your clients tend to say, well, the CCAT said, or the CCAT put us there. Yes, it's true that the algorithms in the CCAT have helped produce those scores, but I continually remind everyone that actually the CCAT doesn't say anything. You guys are the ones who said this, and we've tried to make meaning of this, and we've done it through what we call scales. The scales are the ways that each of the individual 146 questions map to the capacities, and we have validated them, which means that we have gone through our database of over 5,000 nonprofits that have taken the CCAT, and we have all of the results. And we have continually tested our assumptions of which questions roll up to which subcapacities and capacities. And we do it continually so that we can say, yes, actually that holds, and that's why it's statistically validated. It is the only organizational assessment out there where that is possible and has been done, because there is no other organizational assessment that has all of the participants who have administered the assessment in one place, in one database, so that that data can be analyzed. And when you have clients ask you how we know, this is how we know that these are statistically validated results. So I look at the life cycle chart, and I explain to clients that the reason we make a big deal about the life cycle chart, which I'm sure many of you have had the pleasure of trying to interpret, and it's not easy, and that little bar across the bottom is not easy, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But the types of capacities that are prioritized are directly related, as you probably know, to the life cycle stage that an organization is in. And they can, of course, and should, of course, continually cycle through the life cycle and back around to core program development if they are healthy organizations, all right? The CCAT interpretation guide is very helpful, and it talks about the specific capacities that are more important in each of the different life cycle stages, and the more you use it, the more familiar you get with that. We review the entire report. For sensitive issues, we will often talk to the leadership, the senior leadership, or the board chair and the CEO, if there are particular issues, if there's any kind of sensitivities that we should be aware of before we get into a group conversation with everybody who took it. If there's any interpersonal issues we need to be aware of, we like to know about that so that we can really manage the ways that we talk about it. But even if there aren't any sensitive issues, we always talk about the CCAT in terms of where support is most deserved and needed, and never about blame, of course. It's just really interesting, and it's just about how organizations have made choices, and I ask them to tell their stories, which you probably do too, and I'll get into that as well. The only reason I have low scoring subcapacities on here is that folks continually ask us, well, you know, we scored lower in organizational learning actually than we did in leadership sustainability. How come that's not on our priorities? And in many cases, we will, you know, the answer is because it may not be one of those capacities that is most important to the particular life cycle stage that you're in right now. And therefore, the lowest, just because you score lowest in a particular subcapacity does not mean that that's what you need to prioritize. And that's why some capacities that are very low scoring don't end up in the top priorities. And we can talk about that a little bit more. So, questions for the organization. Where is the organization? These are some of the things that we start with. Where is the organization in its organizational life cycle? What are the priority recommendations? Are there recommendations that don't make sense? And I will, as I go through this, I tend to go to the life cycle stage first And then I skip page 11, which is the priority recommendations page, and the reason I do that is because I want to talk through the capacities and the subcapacities and start to get a real sense. I test my hunches, I let folks talk about what they think, and I tend to come back to the priority recommendations page, which is page 11, afterwards, after we've talked through it all, and then it kind of all falls together, and it usually makes sense for me to do that after I've gone through core capacities and subcapacities, and I come back around to that. Can the recommendations be grouped? They can be grouped. It's almost always, it's not almost always, it's most of the time obvious where the focus needs to be. It's, I find, a rare CCAT report that you look at and you realize you've got all four of the core capacities equally emphasized in your priority recommendations. It's, I don't think I've ever seen one with all four that are equally important. But sometimes it's a little harder to actually make sense out of it than other times. Which item in the capacity building plan really excites you and why? It's a great question. I think many of you probably use it. Which items in the capacity building plan or in the, I work with the subcapacities and the general core capacities. Which item scares you? Which ones don't resonate? Which ones feel like they're really on target? I go both ways. And then we talk through, the strengths of the organizations. And we do those first to really legitimize and affirm where people believe they're strong. In the many cases I've had board members say, I don't understand why that's so low, that score, at all. That makes no sense because we do blank, blank, and blank. And then I'll have a CEO who's on the phone pipe up and say, well, actually, that makes total sense to me. I mean, that happens multiple times, either between staff or between staff and board. So this is something we're going to come back to when I go through the 6 steps, but the targeted capacity. But we're working with this matrix that many of you may have seen or may not have seen. And by the way, this PowerPoint will be sent to you all. It's going to be available for you so that you can have it. You can have the recording and have access to it, so you don't have to write furiously or whatever. You can listen and hopefully ask questions soon. But what we've done is we use this to really hone in on where are the trends, if anything is really lining up in one of the 4 core capacities over the other, which one is it? And then depending on where an organization has placed itself in the life cycle stage, we direct them to the box, the cell on this matrix, and I go deeper with the conversation after we've discussed all the core capacities and the subcapacities, and I will say, okay, so we've decided together that, if we were to pick one core capacity that we feel is really where we should put most of our focus right now, not ignore all the others, but put most of our focus because it is the most important to us this minute, which would it be? And let's just pretend somebody says leadership. And they don't say leadership out of the blue. We've identified that from their priority recommendations, from our conversation through the core capacities and subcapacities. And they say, we agree it's leadership. They have actually placed themselves in core program development. And what what they want to wrap their conversation around then is the internal leadership and vision they need to sustain and grow their program model. And I will usually say to an organization that I'm interpreting or facilitating the conversation for, I'll say, does that resonate at all? Does it make sense? It always makes sense because they're the ones who got themselves there. And then I ask them to go deeper and to say, what does that really mean? What does that really look like for you? What does it mean? What would it look like for your internal leadership to construct, to build the agreement and consensus amongst the internal leadership around a vision to sustain and grow your program model? What would that look like for you? Well, how would you do that? Who would be involved? What are the barriers to that? And we go deeper, and I really ask them to tell me what that means in direct relationship to their organization and make it real and pull it out and understand as much as I can about what that would look like and have them understand as much as you can, and listening for the real areas of change. You know, what would change? Would attitudes change? Would knowledge change? What would need to change in the organization to make that possible? And we go very deep, and then we get further into an action plan, which we'll go to in a second. So I'm going to spend just a second on this crazy graphic, which I'm not real fond of. Those of you who know I complain about this graphic, only because I think it's so hard to explain sometimes to clients. But we use it, and the thing I talk about most on this is that the most important graphic element of this, in my opinion, is the turnaround arrow. So I usually focus folks' attention on the turnaround arrow and say, you know, if you get nothing else from this, understand that this is not a one-way street, this progression of an organization. And yes, it starts from the core program development piece on the left and it goes to the right. However, the core program development phase, while it's the first phase any new organization moves into, it is not only a new startup or a young organization that finds itself in the core program development phase. It's imperative that organizations continually circle back around to it, or they're going to stagnate and die, which is what happens on the right side of this picture. And they always look at this and go, well, what does that mean? We're going to stagnate and dissolve or merge. And it really is about, if you're not adaptive and you're not taking in new information and you're not able to continually look at those core programs and be in strategic recalibration mode and responding to your internal and your external environmental factors, you will stagnate and die as an organization. You will lose your relevance, right? And the biggest challenge, and I'm sure you all have found this, is to talk about these little bars on the bottom. And, you know, this particular example obviously is in infrastructure development, but it's right at the line. And what I explain to folks many times when they are either in infrastructure development or in core program development is that you, as an organization, will very likely have built capacity in all three of these areas, the capacities you need most for infrastructure development and impact expansion if you're not a startup. So you've been doing all of these, but the bar, the black threshold bar, that's about 2/3 of the way to the right in each of these bottom horizontal bars, that's your threshold that indicates the capacities that your organization really needs to have in place in order to move to the next life cycle stage. There are a whole host, of course, a whole host of things that can happen to an organization or around an organization that will bump you back around either from infrastructure development or impact expansion back into core program development. Everything from new leadership to the loss of a huge amount of funding that obviously changes your core program needs, to an influx of a lot of money and you have to figure out how to use it, to the stock market, to external factors like the stock market crashing, or a new organization moving in down the block that provides the same services that you do, et cetera. So, and whenever that happens and it flips you back around as an organization into core program development, it is very possible that you need to be there for a short period of time and figure it out, either go through some strategic thinking and planning, and then you may or may not need to go back to infrastructure development depending on whether there's additional infrastructure needed or you already have the infrastructure you need. And you might skip over infrastructure development and move directly into impact expansion. What I also find is that many of the organizations that put themselves in impact expansion or at the very far right, right next to the black bar on the bottom in impact expansion, most of them are about to tip and scoop back around into core program development. They're looking at going back into planning. And so while they see themselves in impact expansion and they're really actively affecting many more constituents than just those that receive direct service from them, they're affecting sectors and fields and communities, the chances are usually great that they need to bump back around and really, when somebody's at that stage, they're doing very well, but they might need to assume a position of leadership that they hadn't before, and therefore there's a need to relook at what they do and to recalibrate where they put their efforts and resources, and maybe pass some on to others in the community and let go of some of the things they do. And I find a lot of organizations that are in impact expansion at a very high level of performance are about to circle back around. And it's a little deceptive when you think, oh, well, everybody's in impact expansion, they're doing great. Actually, they're doing great no matter where they are. They just, what this tells them is where they need to be focusing and prioritizing their capacity and how they need to be understanding what they're building capacity for. And that's the piece that we really discuss in the environmental or the ecosystem framing in 3.0. So here's the prioritized capacity building plan that you all have used and you all know about. And in this one, it's interesting, you know, if you were to look at this, just the way that it shakes out, my guess would be that this is an organization that's probably in infrastructure development phase. It's heavy on the management. They would have potentially scored heavily in management. And in looking at this, even the leadership capacities, the subcapacities that are listed most intensely are about the internal working of staff and leadership to work together. So it is about management. It is about the human resources working well. It's about staff leadership relationship in both internal leadership and leader influence. So remember that matrix we saw before? And even the decision-making tools is really about, you know, increase your use of informal evaluation tools such as client stories and anecdotes. That is important, but what I would say as a focus, if I were looking at this example of a prioritized capacity building plan, my guess is that we would come to a place where we would say it's management we want to be focusing on, and then you would take the stage, the life cycle stage, and you would locate yourself there in that matrix that I showed you earlier with the organization, and then we would tease the story out of them. So that's an example of reading that. This is just another example of the life cycle stage where this organization has bumped itself back. It's what I was talking about earlier, where this organization's placed itself in core program development for whatever reason. If you notice, they have already passed the black bar in infrastructure development. And it's common that folks have this show up on their CCAT report and they're like, well, wait, how can we be past that bar in infrastructure development if we haven't gotten to the bar yet in core program development? How does that work? And we explain what I just explained to you before, which is there are many factors. And if an organization is adaptive and is listening and is not stuck, depending on which one of those factors it is, you know, a leadership change, a funding change, there are many reasons it would pop back around and have to really deal with its core program development and maybe not have to go back to infrastructure development. Maybe they have all the infrastructure to support whatever the change is that they decided to make in their strategy, in their core program strategy. Again, I'm going to ask you guys, if you have any questions, to be shooting them to Keisha by going to the right side, you know, the panel, and clicking the arrows that say send to, and then pick Keisha McKinney and shoot her any questions that you actually have. So here's another one that came out of that's a different, you've got two adaptive decision-making, two adaptive subcapacities in here that are pulled out. You've got two leadership subcapacities, and you've got two management subcapacities. The natures of these are quite different than the ones that we saw before. You know, the quantity and quality of client referrals you make to other organizations, the engaging outside help more often when you are having trouble addressing a management problem. Those are the adaptive pieces that come out. The leadership piece is about increasing staff motivation, increasing leadership's willingness to make changes increasing the amount of interaction between leaders and the staff and strengthening the working relationships. The leader vision is about increasing the leader's ability to motivate others. So this one has much more emphasis on the leadership, and the management pieces are also about leaders consistently following through. While there are 2 of each of these, if you were to read all of these, the piece that jumps out for me happens to be the leadership piece. These are all about how the leader is actually engaging with the outside world and the inside world, and where and how is that membrane remaining semi-permeable, that you're letting in influences, that you're taking information. The place I would focus here is on the leadership box in that matrix and in the core program development phase, which this one comes from the one that we just saw. So I'm just sharing the ways that we've looked at this and would love your input on that in just a sec. I have a question from one of you, and I'm going to go back to the life cycle chart because I know this is one, I could do an entire webinar just on this life cycle chart, and I may do that depending on whether people feel that would be helpful, because I think it's so cool and so interesting and so hard to understand. So one of you wants to know why the bar gets skinnier as you move across the chart, the life cycle chart, and if that means anything. Well, yeah, actually it means everything. So what happens where the thick part becomes skinny here at where my little pointer is, that represents, right here, that represents the place at which, that is the degree to which the organization has built the capacities that are necessary, excuse me, for that particular life cycle stage. So, for example, and they're additive. So the thing that we pay attention to when we interpret and read this is where that thick piece becomes skinnier. Is it before the black line, or is it at the black line or slightly past it, as it is in this slide I'm showing you right now where it says infrastructure development, or is it before the black line, as it is way before in impact expansion? So in this particular slide, you'll see, and what we look for and what the CCAT, the algorithm does, there's an algorithm that takes all the answers and it places the diamond in one of these life cycle stages. And the way that it's constructed is additive, meaning the first of these, colors that go from left to right, blue, orange, dark brown. The first one to the left, where that thick part does not cross the black line, that is the life cycle stage that the organization places itself in at this moment in time. Now, it's, as I said, it's continually changing depending on the environmental factors, the internal and external environmental factors. It is common that this organization, I'm going to just make up a story for this one, which I read into it. This is not a young organization. This is potentially an organization that's actually doing great work. Something happened, a leadership change occurred, or let's make it a happy story. Somebody died and left $30 million to this organization, and they are really functioning quite highly. And they need to know what to do with that money, how to add it to their programmatic delivery, et cetera. So this organization here has been thrust back into making these strategic decisions about how to use their resources and what to do with their programming. They had already achieved a pretty significant level of, they have all the capacities that they need right here for the infrastructure development phase that we're supporting the core program development phase. But they've been thrust back around. They've also built, as you see in the impact expansion, they've also built a significant amount of capacity that they would need to be in the impact expansion stage. But the place they need to be focusing right now and the capacities they need to prioritize are those that would push this thick part of the bar past the black line in core program development. Then they can move back into the other areas. This is what helps the prioritization of what capacities need to be built first happen. So I hope that helps you. Two things, and then I'm going to stop and take a couple of questions, and then I'm going to dive into the targeted capacity building stuff. So some of the things that we do that get ourselves in trouble as interpreters is we focus too intensely on the low scores or the challenges. That is not the place that I really want to put emphasis. What I really like to do is look at the areas in relationship to the actual life cycle stage they've placed themselves in, and think about the way that the high scores and the low scores reflect, relate to each other. A really great example of that is in the leadership area. And those of you who have interpreted the CCAT quite a bit know that it's a very typical situation where there's 5 subcapacities in leadership, and 3 of them go hand in hand a lot. You have, very commonly, you have a very, very strong internal leadership score that goes along with leader vision and leader influence. And it's very common for those 3 to be in partnership with each other very high. At the same time you have those in a high score, you've probably seen many times the leadership sustainability score incredibly low. And sometimes the board score is not so hot either. And sometimes what that usually means is that there's a founding ED or CEO, and they are incredibly visionary, and they may or may not be really strong in translating that vision internally and externally, but there's no succession plan. They have not built a strong bench within the organization. If that person were to be hit by the proverbial bus, they'd be in really deep trouble. In some cases, that leader is so strong that they've had an investment in not letting the board get so strong or have real oversight capacity of the organization, and they haven't really focused on that board development to the degree that they should. So that's an example of where, your low score in leadership sustainability, you want to actually marry to the high scores there and tell the whole story, and what do you need to do about that. So that's one place that we get into trouble. The other is when people go, I disagree with these results. That's fine. It's not that there's anything to disagree with, actually, because these came from them, and we remind them that these came from them. What's really cool when somebody says that is like, that's great. What do other people think? And it's impossible for everybody to be in disagreement with those results because you wouldn't have had those results. And so the gentlest, kindest way to encourage a conversation there and facilitate that is usually the best way to do that. So taking recommendations personally, you guys know you use every ounce you can of diplomacy and discretion to make sure that you continually remind them that none of this is about an individual. This is about the organization, and this is about supporting the organization to holistically become stronger. We gave up. This is not an individual assessment. It's an organizational assessment, and it's the average of a lot of scores. And so there is definitely no way any one individual. It's about perception, right? I have another question that says when the CCAT is administered, or I'll answer that in a second. That's okay. When the CCAT's administered and it's administered again 18 months later, does it matter if the same individuals take it? No, it does not. It's very possible they're not there. The CCAT needs to be taken by whatever leadership is in place at the organization at that time. The same leadership positions would take it because it is a leadership tool, but it will give you a snapshot of the organization at the time it is taken, and we need to remember that. Of course, we don't take recommendations literally, and that's going to be even more emphasized when I go through the targeted capacity building recommendations or process. These recommendations are too vague. These are some of the things that led us to actually really focus in and have the organizations choose the area that is most important and feels most relevant to work on now, and then place it in that matrix and then tell the story very personally. We don't have the resources to do any of these recommendations. That is another reason. These are all reasons that we have started to work with the CCAT slightly differently. It becomes very personalized when we use it now, And this is even more reason why I don't recommend that folks administer the CCAT without a facilitated conversation, without a consultant helping. And this is where you all come in. You're the consultant. You're the ones to facilitate. I do not recommend that organizations do it without the benefit of that, just because I think the value add is so intensely great when you have the ability to hone in on it and have a third party facilitate that conversation. The piece of the targeted capacity building work that we emphasize is an actual work plan, and there, you know, the interpretation that we use now and the way we help groups interpret their CCAT does a couple of things. One, it gives them an action plan that can be operationalized, that can do it, and somebody's responsible in their organization to make it happen. The second thing is that they can use what they've learned in the process of doing the targeted capacity building work to make an incredible case that is so substantiated by the results of the CCAT and the work they've done that they can then bring to a funder if they need outside resources to make this happen and get those resources in a much more effective manner. Or what they can also realize is in asking where, knowing what it is they need to change, who needs to change it, where they could have resources available to them within the community or within their, even within their own organization that they hadn't thought about that will help build that capacity, and that it may not be a matter of bringing a consultant in. There are different ways to address different capacities, and an outside consultant isn't always the way to go. So it helps to figure out where the resources can be accessed. So your CCAT executive summary gives you all of this: the life cycle, prioritized capacity building plan, the leadership, adaptive management, and technical and organizational culture scores, and then it prioritizes and provides next steps. And that's where we get with that. So these are just a couple of the FAQs that we know we get continually, and that as interpreters, you may very well not remember to emphasize enough. So the skipping questions is a big one. Does skipping questions bring an organization's score down? We always encourage people to skip questions if they do not know the answers, especially board members. And we ask the administrator at every organization to remind board members in particular that it is fine to skip questions, and it does not, in fact, skew the results. We need them. It will skew the results if they answer the questions half-assed and without real knowledge. So just let it go. If you have nothing to do with that, it's fine. How is it possible for an established organization to be in the core development stage? I did answer that before, and it's really important that we let folks know that it is really good for an established organization to be in core program development, because it means that they're putting the emphasis on really thinking strategically and recalibrating what they need to be dedicating their time and their efforts to. What is the value of taking the CCAT more than once? We talked about this notion of, you know, doing it as a longitudinal sort of litmus test if an intervention in capacity has actually made a difference in a particular area. Prioritized capacity building plan. If some of the subcapacity scores are really low, why don't they appear on my prioritized list? This is a question we get tons of time, and I explained to you why. It has to do with the life cycle stage. And then the comparison reports. What organizations am I being compared to? And this is the reason why it's so important for every organization to fill out all the background information and to know that they can choose to compare their own scores to other organizations with similar budgets, to other organizations that are content specific, similar to the ones that they, to the way that they describe themselves, or to even budget size and regional placement. So we can do a number of those, and it's if we don't have that in their organizational background, then they can't do the comparative reports. So Keisha, I'm going to ask you to unmute everybody, all 29 attendees, and to let folks who have burning questions related to anything that I just said, maybe ask them, and then I'm going to dive back into targeted capacity because we have about half an hour left. So let's unmute you guys. Oh, there you are. Lots of noise. Does anyone have If you're in a place, though, that is incredibly loud, background noise-wise, mute yourself, if you could. Does anybody have a burning question that you'd like to throw out to the group?
Yes, this is Sharon Jefferson from PACE in Pittsburgh.
Hi, Sharon.
When you're building the comparison report,
yep,
and assuming the group has completed the background questions, if a group either doesn't have budget information to input or doesn't meet the ranges, the comparative report using other parameters still useful?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yeah, thank you. Great question. Yeah. They just can't do a budget comparison, obviously.
So that's how that's done. And if
Great.
you want to start your own broadcast,
anybody else?
Is go ahead and type in what you're seeing
Yes,
now.
this is Molly Penn.
Hi, Molly. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. And this is a great webinar. I have a question about when you're using the CCAT as part of strategic planning.
Yeah.
I could see two possible places where you could use it.
Yep.
One is at the beginning of the strategic planning as part of the internal data gathering.
Yep.
And then the other would be once the organization has started framing goals, using it to match the goals to their current capacity.
Yep. Yep.
So how do you
that's
choose?
great. Okay, so Keisha, I'm going to actually ask you to mute everybody because there is a little background noise, and that gives me the opportunity to answer Molly's question. Great question. We tend to do the CCAT at the beginning, and it is, Keisha, can you mute everybody? That would be great. There, thank you. We tend to use it at the beginning in the initial data collection. Just because we've done it then doesn't mean we don't also use it, as you've indicated, to take, once you've come to mission vision and you're framing your priority goals, to be able to compare the readiness of the organization to actually go that route, say, to pursue a particular set of goals. The reason we do it at the beginning, and we tend to interpret it, somewhere after, the very first planning to plan phase of a strategic planning effort, is because it factors in, I don't know, and I love talking about strategic planning with other, partners in crime here, but we tend to make some hypotheses at the beginning of our strategic planning work. We tend to do a kickoff meeting where we're sure we're all on the same page and to frame some of the questions that we feel will be guiding our data collection for the rest of the planning process before we come together in some kind of a retreat and then guide and facilitate the client to making some choices about the goals that they want to pursue. As part of the initial data collection that we do, we like to present an internal snapshot of strengths, internal capacity, strengths, and challenges, because that's one of the areas that is going to weigh in on coming up. It feeds the determination of what those goals are going to be. So we use it as data, as just one data point for internal capacities that will contribute to the decision-making that happens around setting those goals. Once the goals have actually been determined, we definitely go back to those CCAT results, and we like to align and line up where the organization is in its readiness to pursue each of the different choices that it has. And it helps them realize that, for example, we're working with a particular client now, and we went into the strategic planning with that client envisioning that what they wanted out of the strategic plan was a scaling plan to grow and to grow their impact through replication and more sites. And in fact, through looking at, and they know they want that and they'll be working towards that, but what we learned and they learned by getting access to this information from the CCAT and from other pieces of data was that they actually need to spend the next 3 years of their plan building their readiness to scale, not immediately scaling. So it wasn't that they shifted what they wanted to do, it was just shifting the timing and how they needed to prioritize getting ready on the inside before they could go to that larger scaling. And they got that partially from understanding what their capacities were and how they needed to prioritize building their capacities from the CCAT and from other pieces of data. Molly, I hope that answers that. If it doesn't, I am delighted to continue the conversation with you about that. So I'm going to move into the targeted capacity building, and I will tell you just as a start, I'm not going to go deeply into the different steps of targeted capacity building today. We will probably spend an entire webinar going deep into targeted capacity building, but I wanted to share this with you because it is a very, we tend not to, we really appreciate the incredible value that this provides, and more importantly, we have so many funders on board with this as a true partnership when they're designing their capacity building initiatives. And what we've begun to do and what we would like to encourage you to do and be our allies in doing is to share this and inform funders about this so that there will be much more, the reality is there's not enough money being delivered for capacity building services in the nonprofit sector and in the social sector in general. And our attitude is we would like those resources to actually make a difference. Since they are not really bountiful, they're scarce. And we encourage funders to invest on the front end before they construct their capacity building initiatives in this targeted capacity building process in their grantees, and not use it as an attempt to weed out who should get capacity building services and who shouldn't, but to appreciate who's ready to bring capacity building into their organization at what level, and to provide it at the level that it's right for that nonprofit, okay? So this is how we look at the capacity building learning community these days. We look at it not as, and this is in our 3.0 paper, which is available on our website for free, and we're happy to send it along with this PowerPoint to all of you who have registered. It's not that we're shifting, or we're proposing that we look at who needs capacity, what's the capacity for, and how do we do it in a slightly different way. And the who needs their capacity built is every actor in the social sector, not just the nonprofits. It's the funders, it's the MSOs, which stands for Management Support Organizations, and that's you guys, that's the consultants. It's the government agencies, it's the businesses, and it's networks as entities unto themselves, as well as the nonprofits. And the way that we think about this is that every single one of these players is an investor, is a co-learner, is a knowledge distributor, and is a change agent. And so we've shifted the thinking of capacity building being something that is done to nonprofits only, but it's something that is shared as a joint responsibility by the social sector as a whole. So we've really started thinking about capacity building as a capacity building learning community in a four-part partnership. And that's the nonprofits, the funders, which are the government agencies, the companies, any kind of funder, the local consultants, that's you guys, or organizations. And we have tended to be a frame to bring this into communities, and then we rely on the local consultants to do the delivery of the capacity building itself. But we have tended, and we have done this in about 5 or 6 instances over the last few years, and we're continuing to do this, to encourage communities to build these capacity building learning communities with multiple organizations. These are the different roles that folks play. The funder sets the strategic direction, creates the environment, sets the expectation, obviously provides, and we actually have to add a bullet here. It provides the resources when necessary, the funding resources to kick it off. The organization, the nonprofit, is committed to the change and learning, works with the consultant, and is providing continuous, honest, and authentic feedback on the process. Our role tends to be to collaborate with the funders to design the initiative once we have the information, train or partner with local consultants on the ground to do the targeted capacity building in the communities that you work in, establish and maintain a learning loop with the community so that we can bring this to the larger field and we can apply it to our practice, and we learn that way. The local capacity building providers, that would be you guys, work with the organizations to interpret the CCATs, help organizations create their own capacity building plans where they prioritize, and empower individuals and provide assistance in implementing their plans, really getting the change to happen. So important. This is just a visual depiction of how we're looking at the capacity building learning community and this notion of targeted capacity building. Here's the funder on the left supporting the cohort, but the funder is, and this is the sort of chronological or movement from left to right, how it proceeds. There does need to be an anchor funder or a coalition of funders that come into their own understanding of how to work together at the beginning to be able to support the ability to administer the CCAT to a group of nonprofits that might be their collective nonprofits in a region. So the CCAT's administered. There is a plan development for each organization, and in most cases, when we are working with a cohort or more than one, for the community as a whole. Then there's implementation and technical assistance on the part of the local consultants who do the targeted capacity building work, help with the local understanding and expertise, and make sure that this learning loop where there's ongoing feedback constantly, and there's a role that the local consultant plays between the local funder and the nonprofits so that there's an added layer of increased layer of authenticity and honesty where the organization no longer feels that what they are is a cog in the wheel of a foundation that's just stuck a capacity building initiative out there, but that they're an integral player, and that the knowledge that that individual organization gathers through the CCAT and the targeted capacity building work with the local consultant, that information is going to actually influence the way that the funder builds its capacity building, or the funders build the capacity building initiative. So this is how we look at it. We look at it as being this marriage of any capacity building initiative that's built is this marriage between the foundation's goals and the grantee's needs that we learn about through the targeted capacity building work. And the place that those come together very deliberately, the consultant helps make this initiative happen internally where these two things come together. This is a real-life example, and you don't have to actually read this. The real-life example here is from a particular foundation that we worked with, and when you get this, you can take a look at all these things. What this represents is a logic model, and it's the way one particular foundation actually graphed its desires for its capacity building work. What did it want to achieve with its grantees? How does the capacity building work align with all of the other work the foundation does? And then what was it hoping to get out of it by the time it was finished with a 1-year or a 3-year capacity building initiative that they were prepared to design? Those are the short-term outcomes, what they wanted to see in their grantees. That's the 1 year, and then there's interim outcomes, which was their 3-year. And then the actual strategies that they used were the ways that they constructed a very multi-layered, multi-leveled capacity building initiative that involved coaching, it involved workshops, it involved high-level workshop participation for those organizations that weren't ready to do anything more than that. It involved board work. All of these elements we came up with them in terms of what they'd like to see. We then married this to what we learned in terms of the cohort of nonprofits needs, and we were able to take this and marry it as we did in this circle to the grantee needs and come up with what ended up becoming a capacity building initiative. So targeted capacity building, targeted strategies. We combine the supplemental data that we ask for, which is, I'm going to tell you about in a second. The CCAT data helps foundations achieve their own goals. What does the targeted capacity work look like when we do it as a cohort? What we end up with from the scores of the CCAT and the way that we learn about prioritized capacity building needs and the way to do it is we can cluster the delivery of services for groups of grantees that would benefit from having capacity delivered in a certain way. We can sometimes, it helps with curriculum design to come up with the workshop design and the way that we're going to deliver information. It helps funders with their strategies. It helps build the capacity building strategies for individual organizations and groups of them. It builds the capacity of the capacity builders. So, you know, as you all work in this, it builds your capacity on a continual basis. And most importantly, it builds the entire ecosystem of actors in the social sector. So I am not going to go into a really detailed mapping of the 6 steps today in terms of what they are, but what I will share with you is what these 6 steps are, and we'll do an entire session on them. But the targeted capacity building deeper dive into the CCAT results, we ask for supplemental data from the organizations. And the 2 things that we ask for that are not asked for in the CCAT right now, we ask for them, the organization, to just articulate what kind of organization are you? And we ask them to think about it in terms of a micro-organization or a macro-organization or a hybrid of the 2. And what we mean by that is, are you delivering services to individuals or small communities directly, or small groups of population directly, to families, to regions? Are you providing services? If so, we would classify that as macro in terms of the type of programming that you do. If you're an organization that is a policy change organization, or you are dedicated to changing systems or legislative advocacy work, or how the entire society thinks about something, popular opinion, if that's what you're in business to do, then we would consider you a macro organization. If you do both, we would call it a hybrid. And the reason we ask organizations to think about what they need to build capacity for is because the kinds of capacity that you need, depending on how you think about your role in the ecosystem, are really different. And the things that you end up prioritizing are really different. And so, you know, my colleague Pete York, who designed the CCAT and created it, used to talk about the automotive industry and use that as an analogy. And he would say, you know, the capacities that folks who work in a manufacturing plant need are incredibly different than the folks who work in a showroom in the automotive industry. You work in the same industry, but the kinds of work that you do related to that industry are so different that that's going to determine for what you need to be building capacity. The other thing that we ask in our supplemental data collection that's not in the CCAT is to ask folks to think through and to build a relationship map and to think about who else is in your community, with whom should you be thinking about doing business, whose actions and strategies and decisions actually influence you and the strategic choices you make and the capacities you need to be building depending on what your role in a larger ecosystem might be. So they're relational capacities in a certain sense. It's how do you gain the capacity to be in relationship with the others in your community, in your content-specific community if you're not a geographic community. You know, the LGBTQ community is a great example of that. There is no geographic LGBTQ community, but it is a content-connected community. of organizations who are, dedicated to gender equity, who are dedicated to delivering services to LGBTQ self-identified folks, et cetera. So how do you think about your role within that larger community, and what capacities do you need to build or do you need to prioritize depending on what you know about what others in that community are doing, or others who have effect on that community? Could be funders, could be government agencies, et cetera. All right? So we ask those first, and that's step one. Step two takes in, so it's a combination of these two supplemental data pieces plus the organizational life cycle. Where is an organization in its life cycle? Plus the strengths and the challenges. So remember your matrix chart that you lined up those cells way back here at the beginning? That is step three. It's finding that place in your chart that marries that prioritized core capacity from what you've learned about your strengths and your prioritized recommendations, marries it with your life cycle stage, and then telling the story of what that really means right now in time for that organization. And you as a facilitator would bring that story out and facilitate that conversation. The next question is, what does the change look like? What would it look like to build that capacity that you've talked about in your box here? What would it look like, and who in your organization specifically, it's usually a group of people, not an individual, but who needs their capacity built? Who needs the support to be able to make that change? Where is it needed most? And this is not in any way a blame question or a punitive question. It's like, who do you need to shower resources on in order to make that change happen? And identify that specifically. Really name who those people are specifically. And it's a gift. It's like, who gets the resources showered on them? And then you ask the question, how ready are those change agents to actually make that change? Is it an awareness? Are they even aware they need to build their capacity and what the change is that needs to take place? Are they aware but they don't have the skills to do it? That's a different type of capacity building you're going to need. Are they aware and they have the skills to do it, but they just need somebody to stand next to them and help them get it done? That's a different kind of coaching relationship or a different kind of capacity building that needs to take place. Is it the board? Is it the leadership? Is it the development team? Is it the program staff on the ground whose capacity needs to be built to solve the story you've just told in that box? And then we help folks create an actual work plan where people are responsible for making that happen, and they determine what resources specifically they need to get it done and where those resources can be accessed. So are they resources that can only be accessed from an outside consultant? And if so, how much will it cost? And then you can help that organization go to a funder in such an increasingly informed way to be able to ask for the capacity building resources they need to be able to get that. Alternatively, you can have a funder be able to have access to all the information from the requests and then to design a capacity building initiative or a group of funders for a region, or for a content community, those funders that are specifically dedicated to environmental policy change, those funders that are specifically dedicated to Jewish education or Jewish learning. Those funders, it can be that way too, but you will design your capacity building initiative based on what you've just learned by having invested on the front end in this type of process. And it uses the CCAT, but in a much, much deeper way, as well as these additional lenses that we're working on building into the CCAT at some point around this notion of ecosystem and around the type of organization that you are. So I am going to stop there. That was a ton of information. And what I wanted to do was give you a high-level understanding of the ways that we've been using the CCAT lately and to whet your appetite for additional webinars that are coming up, that will be coming up, that will go deeply into all of these things that you probably, you probably have questions about. So some of the future sessions that we know that we want to do, a whole hour on is, technical content changes to the CCAT that we're thinking about and the kind of research we're doing with the database on additional types of capacities that might be needed now that weren't 10 years ago when we developed it. Marketing the CCAT. How do you actually market it? How do you partner with your local foundations and those who will actually support the nonprofits in your community or communities that would benefit from it? We have lots of ideas on that. I'd love to hear yours. Board source findings and a briefing paper. We're in the process of actually working quite closely with Board Source, having mined the data in the CCAT that we have collected over the last 10 years to make a direct correlation between improving the capacity of the board and how that affects the overall capacity of the organization. And we've now mapped it statistically, mathematically, and we're writing a briefing paper on that, and I'd love input from all of you and to share that with you. And future discussions, lessons learned, we'd love to share those. We'd love to bring up topics and then have everybody participate in that. And hopefully you'll be interested in the LinkedIn group that we're going to be starting. So, what are our next steps? I'd love to hear a couple of questions in the 7 minutes we have left, and I'm sure I won't be able to answer all of them. And I'm going to answer a couple that have been shot in. And I'm going to leave you with a number of resources, which you probably already have, but I'll share with you. So I have a question from somebody that's about certification and that it's expiring soon. What do I need to do to update it? Is that the purpose of the session? Do I need to do something else? We are going to ask that everybody with a CCAT certification that's currently in place, that they we're going to reach out to everybody who is certified in some way, shape, or fashion. We have invited all of you, and we know who you are. There's over 160 CCAT facilitators, certified facilitators across the country. It's growing every month. We do trainings. If your CCAT certification is expiring, I would recommend that you participate. We realize that we don't have a mechanism for reinstating them. There is no test, really, but if you are expiring, I'd ask you to get in touch with Keisha, let her know, and we have a process that we're putting in place to get everybody up to speed so that you're really representing the most up-to-date knowledge about the CCAT. And it'll probably be something like, you need to participate in one webinar, every 12 months or something like that. Is there a significant difference when reviewing the comparison report? Is 10 points equal to, say, 1 standard deviation from the mean? I would love to take that one on in private because I'm not quite sure what you're getting at, but I think I know the answer to that question, and I'd be happy to talk about it offline. And I'd love it if you could unmute everybody, Keisha, and have anybody who has burning questions that you'd like to throw out to me or to the group, be able to ask them in our last 5 minutes. And if you are in a place that is really noisy, if you think it might be even sort of a little bit noisy, could you guys mute yourself so that everybody can hear everybody else? That would be great.
Hi, Julie. It's Sharon again, and I hate to belabor the point about the comparison report.
That's okay.
And you did answer, and it was a real simplified yes. That was the question about if an organization doesn't have budget information as a parameter to put in, is the comparison report still useful? And you said yes, but my follow-up question to that would be, then how do I, when we're interpreting with a group that maybe didn't have that budget information in there, when they push back with, well, how useful is the comparison if we're possibly being compared to another organization that has a different level of resources?
Yeah, and
how do I navigate that conversation?
Great question. I don't quite understand how an organization would not have budgetary information at all to put in there. I think it's really important that something go in there, even if it's the most recent, numbers that they've had, even if they don't have an audited financial report from the current year, whatever the most recent numbers are should go in there so that at least they have a ballpark. They can't use numbers, comparative numbers, in any way that's going to be helpful for them if they don't put their own numbers in. That's the long and short of it, basically. So I wouldn't put a lot of emphasis on a comparison report for an organization that is not able to put any numbers in there, but I wouldn't really understand how they don't have numbers to put in there. You know, if an organization has some kind of concept of what its annual operating budget is or should be, if not, their board should be asking that question. So they have to have something to put in there. So I think the emphasis, I just want to say, I think the emphasis on comparison reports is really helpful, and people really want to know that. I would, with all of this emphasis on what I've talked about today, I would put more emphasis on their prioritized capacity building within their own context, in their own community, to prioritize what it is that they need to be working on.
Okay.
All right. I'm happy to take this up further if I didn't answer your question, though, Sharon, okay?
That was better. Thank you.
Great.
Hi, Julie. This is Sandy Palomo-Gonzalez. I'm actually with a funding organization, and we make grants for capacity building and have organizations take the CCAT. And I have kind of a basic question. I understood that all of the core capacities were important to organizational health, but that leadership and adaptive were really more critical to organizational health. Is that true, and does it depend where you fall on the life cycle, or is that just true in general?
I love that question, and yes, you are right on the mark. And I didn't go into the basics of, it wasn't a 101, but I am so glad you brought that up. Yes, it is true that leadership and adaptive are, and the way you said it was perfect, they are all four very important capacities, and they're all essential. However, the drivers we know are leadership and adaptive, and typically capacity building initiatives have focused on management and technical capacities. It's what folks ask for most often and where they think they need it. If an organization, there is no such thing as a strong and sustainable organization that is strong management and technically and is not strong adaptive and leadership. It all comes down to those as the drivers, and the easiest way to appreciate that is in fundraising. If you ask any nonprofit what they need most, they will all answer the same thing: money, funding, money, resources. And then if you look at the subcapacities on the CCAT, you know that fundraising is considered a skill, and it falls in the technical capacity area. And the reason it falls there is because it literally is it's about having the right skills in your development team or within your CEO and your board, or having systems or CRMs, you know, customer relationship management systems, databases, all that kind of stuff that people ask for because they don't have it. And it does not matter how strong your development team is or whether you have the most state-of-the-art CRM on the planet. If you as an organization cannot articulate clearly and do not have your arms around for what it is that you are raising money, what your vision is, what you're going towards, how you're going to achieve that vision, what your key strategies are to do that, and that you have to, if you can't demonstrate that what you are doing is in fact getting you towards that realization, if you cannot demonstrate your impact. So that falls smack under adaptive, the ability to demonstrate that by collecting data, reflecting on it, and making change in it, and the ability to really articulate and be able to have a solid understanding externally and internally of what it is you're driving towards and where you're going and what your vision is and how you're getting there. If the board, the staff, and the external stakeholders are not on the same page about that, good luck raising money, right? So that's an example of how adaptive and leadership are absolutely driving the others. And thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you.
And it does not matter which, there are various core capacity areas that will pop up as being the most important at that moment in time, depending on the life cycle stage. But for all of them, the adaptive and the leadership capacity are always the drivers.
Thank you.
I'll take one more. I know we're at 2:01 Eastern time, and I'll take one more question. And those of you that need to drop off, I see that many of you have. So is there any other really burning question that somebody has? Otherwise, I'll let you all go on with your day. No. Great. I want to thank you all very, very much for sticking with us through this thing, and it was a ton of information. We welcome thoughts, and we'll probably send you something, just to give us a 2-question answer on how effective or helpful this was. If you could return it, it'd be delightful, and I really appreciate everybody participating, and thank you so much, and have a wonderful weekend all. Anybody on the East Coast, good luck with the weather.
How do we access the PowerPoint?
We'll send it on to you. We're going to send you the PowerPoint. We're going to send you a copy of the 3.0 as a follow-up, and at the same time, we'll send you a little tiny baby questionnaire to tell me what you liked about it, what you didn't, and what we can do differently. All right?
Okay, thanks.